Okay. Good morning, everyone. I'm Ying Zheng, the Director of Asian Initiatives at Western Michigan University's Haneke Institute for Global Education. I also serve as the Director of Timothy Light Center for Chinese Studies. Welcome to Timothy Light Center's webinar series of Spring 2021. Today, we're honored to welcome our guest speaker, Dr. Zhou, Assistant Professor of Sociology and Chinese Studies at the University of Michigan. We first started to contact Dr. Zhou in late 2019 and plan to invite her to give a lecture on our campus in spring 2020. Of course, our plan was changed by COVID-19, as many other things. We're very happy that our plan finally realized in a different form. Dr. Zhou received her PhD from Harvard University in 2017. Her research examines social inequality and state market family relations through the lens of gender, marriage, and reproduction. Her primary interests include gender, fertility, union formation, politics of reproduction, population policy, and innovative methods. Her work combines statistical analysis of survey data, original in-depth interviews, and agent-based computational modeling. Her topic today is the gendered pursuit of individualism, fertility intentions in contemporary urban China. 周老师, please.
谢谢您. Thank you for the kind introduction. I'm going to share my screen now so you can have my slides. Let me know if, if anything. Able to see, okay. Able to see this. Are we all set? Yeah, I think you can all see my screen, right? Okay, great. Thank you, Professor Zheng, for the kind introduction. Welcome, everybody. I am very excited that you were able to join me, and I hope you and your loved ones are doing well in these challenging times. I know COVID has upended a lot of our travel plans. Today, I am happy to share my work with you. This work, the talk today, comes from a larger project of mine that looks at China's recent ending of the one-child policy. The overarching goal of the project is to intersect social demography with law, culture, and political sociology to answer two questions. So on the one hand, how does state exert control over individuals through population policies? And on the other hand, how do individuals conceptualize their individual rights and selfhood under this state control? So today's talk looks at gender, selfhood, and fertility intentions. Let's get started. Dramatic transformations in family life have occurred over the past several decades across the globe. Chief among them, we see a retreat from marriage, a decline in childbearing, and a decoupling between marriage and parenthood. Social demographers describe these trends collectively as the second demographic transition. And the second demographic transitions happened in Western industrialized societies first, and gradually its features diffused across the globe. So to give you an example, here is the global fertility trend from the 1960s to the 2016. So here you'll see three lines, the red being East Asia, the green being European Union, and the blue being North America. So you can see the decline in fertility started in North America and Europe in the 1960s. And over the time, East Asia gradually caught up and now joined the rank of low fertility societies. So faced with these transformations in family lives, naturally, scholars are asking what are the determinants underlying these dramatic transformations in family life? So on the macro level, social scientists have long been interested in the relationship between development and demographic transition. And taken to the micro level, these theories and framework highlight the role of individualism, particularly individuals' growing ideational shift, the growing adherence to individualism. And this is very evident in two of the most prominent frameworks. So in the second demographic transition theory, the target highlights individuals' pursuit of higher order needs, the needs for self-actualizing, self-realization over the primacy of family relations. In other words, marriage and parenthood, in his theory, become secondary to the need for self-actualization, thereby driving the retreat from marriage and childbearing. At the same time, Arthur Thornton highlighted a system of beliefs which he called developmental idealism. Chief among them are the ideals of autonomy, freedom, and individualism. And it is observed that with these ideals on the rise, we see delayed marriage and a smaller family size. However, in these theorizations, gender remains a sometimes overlooked dimension. The desire for self-actualizing needs and the retreat from marriage and parenthood, their link is theorized as agendered, seemingly applying to men and women uniformly. And at the same time, individualism is often highlighted or understood as a broad cultural tenet that characterizes the entire societies, distinguishing them on the spectrum of modernity. However, we know that fertility decisions are made by people. They're made by people embodying gendered bodies and with gendered life experience. So in this talk, I ask, how do women and men make fertility decisions and attach meaning to parenthood and children as they construct visions of self? In asking this question, I try to bring two traditions of scholarship together. The long-standing social demographic research on the one hand that looks at macro-level patterns and trends, and on the other hand, the long theoretical tradition in sociology that explores the questions of selfhood and identity. And drawing on over 100 in-depth interviews with women and men, I argue that fertility decision-making, through fertility decision-making, individuals enact gendered assertions of selfhood. And parenthood is understood and conceptualized by individuals as these gendered means to achieve these different visions of individualism. And specifically, for women view the transition into motherhood as a harbinger of the breaking of the individual self. Whereas for men, what having children means and what parenthood means is integral to the making of an independent and legible self. So in other words, I'm arguing that there is a need to gender the link between the pursuit of individualism on the one hand and the retreat from parenthood on the other. And to arrive at this conclusion and argument, here is the roadmap we're going to travel together. So I'm going to start by setting the scene in discussing selfhood in contemporary urban China. I'm going to draw the connection between individuals' fertility aspirations and their imagined futures. And also, I'm going to briefly introduce you to the population control and reproductive governance in China over the past several decades. And then I'm going to briefly discuss my data and methods, particularly the 115 in-depth interviews that serve as the bulk of the data today. And finally, I'm going to highlight the findings in the question of make or break on how having children and parenthood is viewed as the breaking of the individual self by women, whereas it's viewed as the making of an independent and legitimate self by men. And I'm going to end on some discussions of the theoretical and policy implications of these findings. So, how do we imagine our future? And how does that imagined future tell us something about our present self? Cultural sociologists employ the concept of imagined futures to illustrate this question. Imagined futures, to cultural sociologists, represent a design of a self to which we aspire. And it is one of the key components of an individual's sense of identity. And in this lens, we can look at individuals' fertility aspiration through this concept, looking at how through fertility and fertility aspirations, individuals construct these visions of selfhood. And in this sense, China presents a particularly fruitful ground to look at this link because what individuals imagine as possible in terms of parenthood, in terms of when and how many children they can have, in what context, has historically been heavily constrained by the state. Making fertility this locus that links the personal and the political, where it becomes this locus to see how gendered state control is experienced uncontested in the quotidian life of individuals. So after 1949, China's large population was initially thought as a great thing. It was viewed as a labor reservoir for the new state. However, managing a large and largely rural and poor population soon presented its challenges. So we see voluntary birth planning all through 1960s. However, these efforts are often sporadic and with minimum results. The state enacted the later longer field campaign in the 1970s, the Wan Shangxi. Later refers to later first marriage. Longer refers to longer birth interval between birth, and the fear meaning limiting the number of children couples could have. So 3 children in the rural areas and 2 children in urban areas. So all through the 1970s, China's total fertility rate declined from more than 6 at the beginning of the 1970s to 2.8, 2.9 at the end of the 1970s. So this begs the question, if we're already seeing this drastic decline in fertility, if birth rates are already on the decline, what prompted the Communist Party state to enact the one-child policy, often viewed as one of the most draconian and extreme population control policy enacted? So the one-child policy came at a time when the state was trying to reassert its legitimacy after the tumultuous Cultural Revolution. And here, this time, the state turned to economic growth as the new basis for state legitimacy, rather than revolutionary success. The one child per family is believed to be the optimal population size for economic development. And this assumption was drawing on a very pseudoscientific demographic projections carried out by rocket scientists like Zhou. So, in other words, controlling reproduction and population becomes a way for the state to achieve the goals in production and development. So, throughout the 1980s, we see fluctuations, but now China has joined the rank of low fertility societies. Demographers have largely reached the consensus that total fertility rate has dropped to and stayed below replacement level since the early 1990s, 1991, 1992. So faced with this current dilemma of declining fertility, shrinking labor pool, and rapid population aging, in 2016, the state shifted toward a universal two-child policy, with the policy goal to deal with these challenges of sustained low fertility. And unlike previous relaxations to the one-child policy, where where in one iteration, if both partners are by partners I mean husband and wife, it's always under the heterosexual marriage. If both partners are singleton children, we're allowed to have 2 children. And then later that relaxation expanded to include all husband and wife, as long as either of them is a singleton children. However, different from these earlier version of relaxations, which often met with factional debates, which is often sometimes there are provincial differences, and sometimes there are back and forth in terms of relaxations. The 2016 Universal Two-Child Policy was met with concerted state promotion. So here are the 2 examples you see. On the left-hand side, this is in Yichang, one of immediately after the relaxation of the two-child policy, there was this 红头文件, this letter directed at all Communist Party members, exhorting them to either lead the way in having 2 children or encourage their children to do so. And on the other hand, you see state media, the constant push to highlight, to showcase local government that have put forward measures that incentivize second birth. So the point I want to make here is that universal two-child policy is met with this concerted state promotion. And despite this seemingly relax of birth quota, we see some similar flavor to the earlier version of the one-child policy. So again, the policy goal is not to expand reproductive rights or the right to have children, but rather it's really to deal with the challenges of declining fertility, shrinking labor pool, and rapid population aging. Again, in the same way that one-child policy is, using reproduction to serve the goals of production. Again, here under universal two-child policy, we still see population size as part of the political calculation for achieving political goals. And in this process, woman's body becomes this vehicle for the achievement of urgent demographic targets. So, in this context, I ask, how do women and men make fertility decisions and attach meaning to parenthood and children as they construct visions of self? Writ large, this is a question of what does it mean to be an independent and autonomous self under very strict reproductive governance? And to answer this question, I draw on 115 in-depth interviews. In-depth interviews, unlike traditional demographic method that typically rely on surveys, in-depth interviews are particularly well equipped to uncover individuals' deeply held values and beliefs. So I conducted 115 in-depth interviews in 2 metropolitan areas. And because this is a relatively small sample, to avoid over-fragmentation in the final sample, I relied on snowballing with strict sample selection criteria. So to qualify for the study, one has to be include both men and women, and one has to be within age 22 to 38. Thereby, they are currently making marriage and fertility decisions. And I included only heterosexual adults, and then I also included individuals who are who have completed some form of tertiary education. And the individuals, although they are men and women, they're not in union with each other. And I'm happy to talk more about the research design in Q&As. And I know, especially at COVID time, this kind of field work has largely been disrupted. So I'm also happy to talk about, what do we do about that? So because this is snowball sample, to avoid, clusters in the final sample, avoid just end up with several groups of friends, basically, I limited how many seed in the referral train. So each of the seed can only introduce me to at most 3 other people, and we will go from there. So after this, I checked, how the final sample looked like. There doesn't seem to be clusters, which is a good thing. So I stopped recruiting and interviewing when data saturation is reached. By data saturation, I mean that when there's no new theme emerge with each additional interview. So this is what the final sample looked like. So I include individuals in 3 life course stages: those who are never married, and those who are in their first marriage without children, and those who are in their first marriage and had 1 child. So by this construction, I was able to capture individuals at 3 life course stage, and were able to look at their transition first into marriage, and transition into first child, and potentially transition into second child. So the final sample include about 70 women and 45 men, and about half of them are never married, and half of them are married. Within the ones that are married, about half of them, or a third of them, have 1 child, and the rest do not have kids, have no children. So in the interview protocol, because of how the sample is set up, I was able to look at individuals transitioning to marriage. So we discussed their dating history, their marriage timing, and what are the obstacles they view as keeping them from getting married if they want to get married. And we also discussed what are the conditions for them to wanting to get married. So sometimes the answers about housing comes up, as you would expect in China. And we also discussed their transition into childbearing. So what are the timing, what are the ideal timing that they look themselves that they want to have a child. And we talked about their fertility ideals and intentions. So ideally, how many children they want to have, when, and when do they intend to have their first or sometimes second child. And we also discussed, what are the obstacles they view in transitioning into parenthood. And also we discussed their life at work. So we talked about, particularly with women, their job search experience. We talked about their workplace routine, what is the typical workday looks like. And we talked about if and to what extent there are family-friendly policies and the norms of using those policies at their workplace. And we also talked about their family life. So what is the typical day at home? So how are household work divided? Is the division of household work their ideal, and is there a gap between their ideal and actual division of housework? And also we talked about if there are outsourcing arrangement, either with the market or with grandparents in terms of childcare and housework. And then finally, I adopted the word value survey, which is using survey to gauge an individual's gender-related attitudes. And I incorporated that into the interview, and just to have some sense about how do these respondents see gender roles, what are viewed as appropriate and the right roles divisions among them. So, and then finally, I also asked very bluntly about their attitudes toward 1 child and the universal 2-child policy. So together, the interview provides a holistic picture of how individuals make decisions about marriage and reproduction, and how they make these discussions, both constrained by a host of external opportunities and constraints, both at the family level, the labor market level, and the state level. So I collected my data using phone and face-to-face interviews from January and to July. So after, and these are the 2 pictures in the data collection. So I was writing my dissertation at the time, so some of the data are collected while I was still in Boston, while others to make sure that phone interviews doesn't distort the data quality. I also carried out face-to-face interviews when I went to China during the summer to do field work. So after the data was collected, I repeatedly listened to the recordings, encode the transcriptions, write analytical memos, and all of these helped me to identify the themes in-depthly that come up from the data. So, make a break. How do women and men view their fertility aspirations, and how does that relate to their visions of self? So I want to introduce you first to Zhou. Zhou is a 31-year-old woman. She has been married for 4 years, and she does not intend to have children. And when I asked her, why do you not want to have children? What does having children mean to you? Zhou said, I don't really want to have children. I'm worried. Having children is going to be a large, completely transformative impact. I don't know if it's selfish, but I don't want to prioritize my own development. And Zhou is not alone in setting up this contrast, in setting up having children as completely transforming oneself. And even among individuals, even among women who do intend to have children, who are in the process of getting ready to have children, we see this theme repeatedly coming up. So Anling was also 31-year-old, and Anling has been married for 2 years. And when I met her, and when we sat down and had our interview, Anling was already in the process of trying for children. So earlier in the conversation, she told me, how she and her husband were both trying to take supplements, how they were very cautious about stop smoking, getting exercise. So it's a couple that are actively trying for having children. However, when I asked Anling, okay, what does having children mean to you? Anling said this. I don't plan on being 丁克, double income, no kid. I don't plan on being a dink. So sooner or later, I would have to have one. 我必须得要一个小孩. I'm really afraid though. 我很害怕. So if you ask me, what is the ideal time to have children? There's no ideal time. The ideal time is when I couldn't possibly delay anymore. Seeing how my female colleagues are after having children, I'm truly terrified. They change so much. They have their children, but they don't have a self anymore. I'm so afraid I'd end up like them. So if you were just looking at survey data, if you're looking at, when is she going to have a kid? What is she doing? Is she using contraceptives? You will see a woman who is actively planning for having children. But by looking at the interview data, you delve deep into how she really feels about it. You see the tension, you see the hesitance, you see the fear, you see the ambivalence toward having children. So Anling presents a typical picture that is coming up repeatedly in the interview. And it's on the one hand, they don't really want to have children, but on the other hand, they do not want to be strong enough that about the relation. So in other words, they are going to have a kid, but they're ambivalent about it because what they see is having children being such a transformative experience that completely upend one's sense of self. So what having children means among female respondents? Having children is viewed as this transformative change that completely upend the ideal of self. And in this sense, when we delve into, as corroborative evidence, we delve into their most common preconditions for childbearing, oftentimes it is having established or having a okay career. And this rationale, though, different from other settings, this rationale has little to do with financial security. So we were able to do the study also looking at Spain and Japan. And I'm writing a different paper on that. And there you see, again, the rationale of having established a career, but oftentimes it has to do somewhat with financial security, especially in the Spanish context. But here in the Chinese context, this rationale has little to do with financial security. Rather, being able to have an established career is a way to be able to cultivate an identity and the self that is autonomous from home. In other words, having children is viewed as this breaking of individual self, and to really hedge against it, having an established career allows this cultivation of an identity and self. However, this is only women. When we look at men, and when we look at men's fertility aspirations and how it fit into their construction of self, we see a completely different picture. So Jie was 32 years old, and he has married to his high school sweetheart for a while when we had our interview, and they were married. And when I interviewed Jie was married but did not have kids yet. So I asked Jie, "Do you want to have children?" And Jie said, "Do you want to have a child?" Jie said yes. So I asked, why? What's your rationale for wanting to have a child? And Jie was perplexed, and he said, he was thrown off by a question, and he was perplexed. And he said, "What do you mean, why I'm going to have a child? What kind of question is that? It's a thing you do. It's a thing that everybody does." And not surprisingly, after the interview, I was told, and I was told that he soon had a child. And then we see this normative expectations ideal popping up across male interviewees as well. So for example, Le was also 31 years old, and Le was married without children. And when I asked Le what having a child means to you, Le said, when you are married and together all the time, romantic love turns into a familial bond. And with a familial bond, everything feels natural. You produce a kid and bind the two people together. So in other words, for Le, again, having children is viewed as this natural next step following a marriage. Having children makes love, makes a romantic bond into a familial bond, and it makes a marriage real. So it cements the marriage. So what having children means among the male respondents, it's often, this is something you should do. And when you have a kid, you become legible. People have a handle on you. People know, this is what you did, something that you should do, and you fit, and that's the normative expectation. And also a child turns a couplehood into a real family of one's own. And it's not just, romantic love, rainbow unicorn puppies anymore. It's a real family of one's own, and closely linked to this image of a family of one's own is their vision of an ideal man. An ideal man that are able to providing for the family. So in this sense, having children becomes this integral to the making of an independent and also a legible self. Quite different from the picture that we see from the female respondents. So this is what I call the make or break, the gendered pursuit and the gendered ambivalence. For women, having children means the transforming and upending of self. It is often viewed as an obligation that they cannot opt out of. And here we see a greater desire also to retreat from parenthood. Whereas when we look at our male respondents, such ambivalence is absent from men. Children is largely viewed as this natural next step in life course, the natural next step following marriage. So in other words, with this, I'm arguing that the pursuit of individualism and the retreat from parenthood is an inherently gendered link, because what having children mean in one's self, in the making and breaking of self, is inherently gendered. So both individualism and the pursuit of individualism and how it relates to the retreat from parenthood, as theorized by scholars of demographic transition, is inherently a gendered link. So what might explain these gendered patterns we see? On the micro level, care work is still women's work. This is both evident from my own research and also from the surveys, large-scale time use surveys that are done in China. So, for example, when I asked Li Ran, a 37-year-old woman who is also a mother of one daughter, Li Ran works as a head, school administrator in one of a very well-regarded public school in one of the cities. And she has a husband. Her husband works in government, and they both have very long hours. She being a teacher / administrator, her husband, working in government. However, Li Ran shouldered the majority of their care work of their young daughter since the daughter was born. And when I asked about Li Ran, how things are divided, what things look like at home, she said, what having children, impacted her life. How having children impacted her life. Li Ran said, men's lives don't really change with children. It all falls onto the mother. Like when I take my daughter to her extracurricular activities on weekends, mostly you'll see other moms there with their children and one occasional dad. So this micro-level patterns is reproduced and reinforced by the meso-level context. So after marketization, China's work units, the role of work units drastically changed in providing provision services. Under the social state socialism, work units, a lot of care work and domestic labor are subsumed into work units in urban areas. And that role of work units dramatically changed, shifting those labor back to the family and back to women. And on the macro level, it is also a question of how state through population policy sees women. So, for example, Hualing, a 28-year-old woman married without children, I asked her about how she feels about state population control policy. And she said, the government doesn't really see us as a human being, but as human resources. So in this sense, we see that the micro level gender dynamics reinforced by meso and macro state level. Having children in this sense, both through having children, women are subsumed into the reproductive labor at home and is subsumed into the policy narrative that views a woman's body as this vehicle to achieving demographic targets. So through having children, women are both are binded to the family and the women are binded to the state. So through this talk and through this work, what I want to argue theoretically is the need for us to gender the link between individualism and family change. But also, I hope to end on some policy implications. The demographic process are fundamentally gendered process, and that calls for a need to move beyond spreadsheet demography and really look and center the notion of reproductive rights and gender equity in population policies. So thank you. I look forward to your questions and comments.